On that fateful morning, on the street leading to the Rossi estate, Emma Carter slipped on a single puddle and fell headlong, sending her handbag flying and scattering an entire collection of adhesive bandages across the sidewalk, where they rolled in every direction. She scrambled back to her feet, brushed off her dress, peeled open a bandage, and stuck it diagonally across her forehead where she had just struck the lamppost, then calmly continued walking as though nothing had happened. Because for Emma, falling was an everyday occurrence, and so was getting back up. Emma was 27 years old, had lost both her mother and father, had raised her younger sister alone for 8 long years, and had just lost everything she owned to a man she had once trusted. People looked at her and called her clumsy, awkward, and so painfully honest that she simply couldn't keep her mouth shut. But they didn't understand that the very way she fell, bandaged her own wounds, rose to her feet, and kept moving forward with a smile, was precisely why she had never truly been defeated. No matter how many times life knocked her to the ground, she had never allowed it to take away her warm heart or her sharp mind. She didn't need to pretend to be perfect to be strong. She was strong precisely because she dared to be awkward, dared to be sincere, dared to be hurt, and then dared to mend herself all over again. And that same girl who was always falling was about to shake the world of the most powerful man in Chicago, Michael Rossi, a man who had built a wall around his heart that no one had managed to touch in 15 years, because to him, trusting someone was no different from signing his own death sentence. No accountant who had ever worked for the Rossi Mafia family had survived longer than a month, so people wagered that she wouldn't last 3 days in his world. But sometimes, the thing capable of bringing an entire empire of darkness crashing down isn't guns, ammunition, or power. Sometimes, it is a clumsy, outspoken young woman carrying an entire collection of adhesive bandages and a stubborn soul that will never allow life to extinguish her light. Before we begin the story, don't forget to leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The iron gates of the Rossi estate closed behind Emma with a cold, echoing clang, and she stood there in the middle of an immense marble entrance hall, wondering how many times in her life she had arrived late somewhere, that being late could cost her life. Her battered old car had broken down in the middle of the road, coughing out a cloud of white smoke as though it, too, knew enough to fear the Rossi family and had tried to escape, forcing her to walk nearly 2 blocks with her hair in disarray and a panda-patterned adhesive bandage still stuck crookedly across her forehead from when she had run into a lamppost earlier. 2 broad-shouldered, heavily built men escorted her inside without saying a word, and one of them pointed toward the long table, signaling for her to put down her bag. "Weapons check," the guard said curtly, and without waiting for her consent, he seized her worn old handbag and emptied it upside down onto the table. Then the entire room fell silent, because instead of a gun, a knife, or anything else dangerous that one might expect from someone bold enough to walk into the lion's den, what came tumbling out was an entire shower of adhesive bandages in every imaginable color and pattern. Pandas landed beside unicorns, dinosaurs rolled over chubby cats, some glowed in the dark, some were as large as shoe inserts, and others were tiny enough to cover the tip of a single finger, all of them spreading across the table like the wares of a carnival stall in the gloomy entrance hall of a mafia family. The guard stood frozen, the empty bag still clutched in his hand, staring at the pile of bandages, and then at Emma, with no idea how he was supposed to respond. Emma swallowed, trying to keep her voice steady even though her heart was pounding. "Those aren't weapons, although I suppose that depends on how you define a weapon." No one laughed. A heavy wooden door at the far end of the room opened, and a man stepped through, and suddenly the temperature in the room seemed to fall by several degrees. Michael Rossi was tall and powerfully built, dressed in a dark suit tailored perfectly down to the last stitch, his black hair combed smoothly back and touched with a few premature strands of silver, and his eyes were so cold that Emma felt as though they were reading straight through her skull. He glanced at the pile of adhesive bandages on the table, then at the Panda bandage on her forehead, and his gaze lingered there longer than necessary, as though he were trying to solve a problem whose answer made no sense at all. He sat in the chair across from her, opened a thin file, and began speaking in a low, quiet, measured voice, the voice of a man who knew he never needed to raise it, because the entire world was already expected to fall silent and listen. Emma Carter, 27 years old. Your father, Daniel Carter, borrowed $340,000 from our organization before he died. No collateral, no guarantor, not a single cent left behind except for that debt. He turned a page slowly. You lost your shop. You also lost your savings to a man who walked away. In other words, Miss Carter, you are now at the lowest point to which a human being can fall, and you arrived 20 minutes late to meet me. Emma stood there with her hands clasped tightly together to keep them from trembling, and she should have been afraid, she should have cried, or dropped to her knees and begged as anyone in her circumstances would have done, but instead, she drew a deep breath and heard herself blurt out, "You forgot to put in the file that I also support a cat who eats like a lion. And my car died in the middle of the road, so if you want to blame someone for those 20 minutes, please blame the engine instead of me. I'm the unfortunate one here." Somewhere in the room, someone drew a quiet, startled breath. Michael Rossi lifted his eyes to her, truly looking at her for the first time, and for one long, suffocating moment, no one in the room dared to move, because in all the years he had ruled, no one had ever spoken to the boss in the same tone one might use while arguing with a grocery store cashier. Emma felt her knees threatening to give way, but she raised her chin, because if this was destined to be the worst day of her life, then at least she would meet it standing tall, just as she had always risen after every fall. Michael Rossi closed the folder slowly, and for a long moment he simply studied her, the way a man studies a card he cannot quite decide whether to play or discard, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost none of its cold precision, but had gained something else, something almost like curiosity. "Sit down, Miss Carter," he said, and Emma, who had been standing on legs that felt like overcooked spaghetti, sank gratefully into the chair across from him before her knees could betray her. "You are a forensic accountant, or you were, before your life fell apart. That is the only line in this file that interests me." Emma blinked, still trying to peel the Panda bandage off her forehead without much success. "Most people find the part about the debt more interesting," she said. "The debt bores me," he replied flatly. "Money that is owed is simply money that will eventually be collected, one way or another. What does not bore me is money that vanishes." He leaned back, and behind him a broad-shouldered man with graying temples and a quiet, watchful face shifted his weight. A man Michael introduced with a single glance rather than a word. "Someone inside my organization has been draining accounts for months. Small amounts at first, then larger, buried under 100 false entries so clever that the 3 best people I pay could not find the seam. The authorities have begun sniffing at my books. And I find myself in a position I have not been in for 15 years, Miss Carter, a position where I cannot trust a single person who sits at my table." Emma stopped fussing with the bandage. "And you think you can trust me? A woman you dragged here over a dead man's debt, who you've known for about 4 minutes, half of which I spent talking about my cat?" A faint sound came from the corner of the room, a capo smothering something that might have been a laugh, and Michael's eyes flicked toward it, and the sound died instantly. "No," Michael said, "I do not trust you, but that is precisely the point. Everyone in this house belongs to someone, owes something, wants something. You belong to no one. You have no allegiance to protect, no cousin to shield, no faction to feed. A stranger with nothing to gain by lying is worth more to me right now than a lifetime friend with everything to hide." He let the words settle, and Emma understood, with a small cold shiver, that he had just told her the loneliest thing she had ever heard a man say out loud, and that he did not even realize it was lonely at all. "So here is the arrangement," he continued. "You will go through every ledger this family keeps. You will find the person bleeding me dry. You will do it under the eye of Tony Marino, who will not leave your side, who will drive you, watch you, and report every breath you take back to me. And if you find what my own people could not, your father's debt disappears, every last cent of it, as though it never existed. Emma sat very still, and somewhere in the doorway she heard two of the men murmuring to each other, one betting the new girl would crack and run inside 3 days, the other saying he gave her a week at most, the way men place bets on a horse they have already decided is going to lose. She should have been terrified. She was terrified. But $340,000 was a mountain she could never climb in 10 lifetimes of counting other people's money, and her sister Lily still had a future somewhere on the other side of that mountain, and Emma had spent her whole life learning that the only thing more dangerous than a bad choice was refusing to make any choice at all. So she reached into the pile of scattered bandages still lying on the table, selected a bright green dinosaur, and pressed it deliberately over the panda already on her forehead, as if arming herself. "Fine," she said, lifting her chin. "One condition, if your Mr. Marino is going to follow me everywhere for weeks, he has to at least let me pick the radio station in the car." For the first time, something flickered behind Michael Rossi's eyes, gone almost before it arrived, and he rose to his feet, buttoning his jacket. "Start tomorrow morning," he said. "The others are betting you won't last the month. I would advise you to prove them wrong." The office they gave Emma the next morning was buried 2 floors beneath a casino the Rossi family owned, a windowless room that smelled of old paper and colder secrets, and as Tony Marino led her down the corridor, she caught the tail end of a conversation between 2 capos who did not bother to lower their voices quite enough. "That's the new one? The accountant?" one muttered. "She won't be around long. Remember the last guy? The nervous one with the glasses? 9 days. Then poof, transferred to Arizona, if you know what I mean." The other snorted. "There was a woman before him too. Real sharp. Lasted almost 3 weeks before she suddenly decided she missed her family in Canada and was never heard from again." Emma's stomach tightened into a small, hard knot, but she kept her face pleasant and her steps steady, because she had learned long ago that the surest way to look weak was to let anyone see you flinch, and so she simply turned and said, "If I disappear to Arizona, tell my cat I loved her," and walked into the office before they could decide whether she was brave or insane. Tony Marino settled into a chair by the door, with a newspaper he clearly had no intention of reading, his eyes tracking her every move, and Emma got to work. She looked at the towering stacks of ledgers, the boxes of receipts, the years of entries logged in a dozen different hands, and where anyone else would have seen chaos, she saw a language waiting to be read. She began the way she always did, not by reading the numbers but by sorting them, pulling out colored sticky tabs from her bag and dealing them across the pages, green for what looked clean, yellow for what deserved a second glance, red for the entries that made the small hairs on her arms stand up, for reasons she could not yet explain. Tony watched her paper the sacred books of the Rossi family in a rainbow of tabs, and said, in a voice caught somewhere between alarm and disbelief, "You know those ledgers are older than you are." Emma did not look up. "And they've never been organized properly a day in their lives, which is probably exactly why someone's been robbing you blind under your nose." And for 3 hours she said almost nothing, cross-legged on the floor with ledgers fanned around her like the petals of some enormous, sinister flower, and Tony, despite himself, found he could not look away, because something was unsettling in the way this clumsy woman who had tripped over her own shadow that morning went utterly still and precise the moment numbers were in front of her, as though the flailing surface hid a mind that ran cold and clean as a machine. And then she stopped. Her finger, which had been sliding down a column of expenditures, halted on a single line, backed up, and came to rest there. "Huh," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "That's weird." Tony lowered his newspaper. "What's weird?" Emma tilted her head, tapping the entry. "This maintenance fee. Property maintenance, listed against one of the warehouses. It shows up every month, same account, and the amount's just a little too round. Real maintenance is never this tidy. It's always $411.17, because somebody bought a specific part, not a clean number over and over like clockwork. She flipped back a few pages, then a few more, her frown deepening. And here it is again, and again, same fee, same warehouse, month after month, going back a long, long way. Either that building is the most high-maintenance pile of bricks in Illinois, or somebody's using it as a little door to walk money out of the house, one polite payment at a time. She did not understand, not yet, what she had just brushed against, did not know that her rainbow-tabbed finger had come to rest on the very first thread of a web that would nearly cost her everything. She only knew, with the quiet certainty she trusted more than anything else in her life, that it was wrong, that it felt wrong the way a false note in a song feels wrong even to someone who cannot read music. She reached for a red tab and pressed it firmly against the page. What she did not see was the way Tony Marino had gone completely still behind her, the newspaper forgotten in his lap, staring at the line she had circled, as though she had just casually pointed at a landmine in the middle of a garden, because in 3 weeks of frantic searching, 3 of the smartest people Michael Rossi had ever paid had walked past that exact entry 100 times and never once stopped. The next morning, Emma arrived at the underground office, armed with 2 paper cups from the little cafe around the corner, a fresh dinosaur bandage pressed over yesterday's on her forehead, because, as she explained to nobody in particular, a girl needed a little armor on a day she was going to spend digging through a mob family's dirtiest secrets, and when Tony informed her that Michael wanted to see the maintenance fee she had flagged, she marched up all the way to his top-floor office, carrying both cups, as though they were peace offerings for a very well-dressed dragon. "Good morning," she announced, setting one cup on the vast expanse of his desk. "I brought coffee. Consider it a gesture of goodwill from your favorite person, currently reorganizing your entire financial history." Michael looked at the cup the way most men would look at an unexploded device. "I didn't ask for coffee." "Nobody ever asks for the good things in life," Emma said, dropping into the chair across from him. "It's a vanilla latte, extra sweet. I had a feeling you needed it." Michael picked the cup up, sniffed it, and set it back down with the faint grimace of a man who had been personally insulted. "I drink my coffee black, no sugar, no milk, no." He gestured vaguely at the cup, "Whatever that is. Everybody drinks it black, until they try something that actually tastes like it was made by a human being, instead of a machine that hates joy," she countered. "Come on. 1 sip." He took 1 sip, purely, she suspected, to end the argument, and his expression twisted as though he had swallowed something medicinal. "It tastes like a dessert had an accident." "It tastes like happiness, is what it tastes like," Emma said, taking a long, satisfied pull from her own cup. "But I'm starting to understand that happiness isn't really your thing." Michael set the coffee down and fixed her with that cold, flat stare that had made grown men across the city go quiet, but Emma had already leaned forward, chin propped on her hand, studying him with an unguarded frankness that unsettled him far more than any threat ever had. "You know," she said, "you treat a cup of coffee like it's a matter of life and death. Black, exact, no room for anything soft, because if you let one small pleasant thing slip past your guard, who knows what else might get in. And I'd bet money, if I had any, that you talk to everyone in this building like they're machines that occasionally malfunction, and that when you go home at night to whatever enormous cold apartment a man like you lives in, you eat dinner alone, standing up, reading something about money, with the television off because silence is easier than pretending anyone's coming home to you." The room went very quiet. Somewhere below them the casino hummed, but on this floor, there was only the faint tick of an antique clock, and the sound of Michael Rossi not answering, which was, Emma realized, its own kind of answer. His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought she had gone too far, that she had finally found the exact line that got Clumsy accountants transferred to Arizona, but he did not raise his voice, did not so much as lift a hand. He simply said, very low, "You've known me for 2 days." "I've known people like you my whole life," Emma said, and her voice had softened now, all the teasing drained out of it. "The ones who decided a long time ago that needing someone is the same as handing them a knife. I'm not judging you for it. I just think it must be exhausting, holding that wall up every single hour of every single day, never once getting to set it down." Michael looked at her for a long moment, and something passed behind his eyes, quick and buried, a crack of light under a locked door before it was sealed again. He picked up the black coffee she had not brought him, the one already waiting on his desk, and took a slow sip of it instead. "Show me the warehouse entry," he said, and his voice was steady, but he did not meet her eyes when he said it. And Emma, who noticed everything, noticed that too. She stood, gathered her cup, and paused in the doorway. "For the record," she said gently, "the wall doesn't make you safe. It just makes you alone. There's a difference." And then she was gone down the hall before he could decide whether to be furious or grateful that, for the first time in 15 years, someone had looked straight through him and stayed anyway. It happened 3 days later, on an afternoon when the whole upper floor of the Rossi building had gone tense and electric, in a way Emma had learned to recognize the way a farmer reads a darkening sky. And when Tony walked her past the conference room, she caught fragments of a heated conversation through the half-open door, Michael's voice low and controlled and, underneath the control, genuinely worried. A legitimate deal, one of the family's clean ventures, a real estate acquisition that laundered nothing and existed purely to give the empire a respectable face, was collapsing, because a lawyer on the other side had found a clause that would let his client walk away and take a substantial deposit with him, and the Rossi attorneys were pacing the room in expensive suits offering nothing but expensive shrugs. Emma should have kept walking. Tony certainly wanted her to keep walking, but she paused in the doorway, a folder of ledgers hugged to her chest, and before her brain could stop her mouth, which was a lifelong problem of hers, she said, "That's not actually a dead end, you know." The room fell silent, and every head turned, and one of the lawyers gave her the particular look men in good suits reserve for women they have decided do not belong in the room. "This is a legal matter," he said coldly. "I'm sure it is," Emma agreed, "but it's also a tax matter, and those two things are wearing the same coat right now, and everybody in here is only looking at the coat." She stepped inside, set her folder down, and pointed at the paperwork spread across the table. "The clause lets them exit, sure, but only if the transaction is classified the way it's currently classified. If you restructure the acquisition as a phased asset transfer instead of a single purchase, that clause stops applying, because there's a provision in the state tax code, passed a couple of years ago and barely reported, that treats phased transfers completely differently. They lose their exit. You keep the deposit, and it's all perfectly, boringly legal." For a long moment nobody spoke, and then the senior lawyer snatched up the documents and began reading, and his face slowly changed from condescension to something far less comfortable. Michael had not said a word. He was leaning against the far wall with his arms folded, watching Emma the way a man watches a card he has just discovered is worth far more than he paid for it. And when the lawyer finally looked up and said, quietly, "She's right. It works," Michael did not smile, but something in his posture shifted, some invisible weight redistributing itself. He crossed the room, stopped in front of her, and asked the question she could see had been genuinely bothering him. How does a forensic accountant know an obscure provision of the state tax code by heart? Emma shrugged, suddenly a little self-conscious under the full weight of his attention. "I read things. When I can't sleep, which is most nights, I read whatever's around. Tax code, medicine labels, the backs of cereal boxes. You never know when a useless piece of information is going to stop being useless." She fiddled with the corner of her folder. "My mother used to say I was the only person she knew who could trip over a coffee table and land on exactly the one fact you needed." And there it was, the thing that had not happened before, the thing that changed the temperature of the room in a way that had nothing to do with money at all. Because for the first time since the iron gate had clanged shut behind her, Michael Rossi looked at Emma, not as a debt to be collected, not as a stranger to be used and watched, but as something startlingly close to an equal. "Thank you, Emma," he said, and the sound of her own name in his mouth caught her off guard, low and unhurried, stripped of all the cold formality of Miss Carter. She blinked. "You called me Emma." "Don't get used to it," he said, and turned back toward the table, but the corner of his mouth had done something that, on any other man, she might almost have called the beginning of a smile, and Emma stood there clutching her folder, a green dinosaur bandage crooked on her forehead, feeling, absurdly, dangerously, like she had just won something far more valuable than she was ready to admit. A week later, Michael informed her, in the same tone he might use to announce a change in the weather, that she would be attending the family's annual charity gala, and when Emma protested that she was an accountant hiding in a basement and not the sort of person one brought to galas, he explained with cold patience that the woman who had restructured a failing acquisition in 90 seconds was now, whether she liked it or not, someone the family wanted seen in the right light, and that the event was a glittering, respectable mask the Rossi Empire wore once a year, so the city could pretend not to know what lay beneath it. Which was how Emma found herself, on a Saturday evening, standing at the entrance of a 5-star hotel ballroom, in a rented dress the color of a cherry, a bold and defiant red that stood out like a struck match against the muted grays and blacks and diamonds of the most powerful people in Chicago, trying very hard to walk in heels that seemed to have been engineered by someone who actively despised her. The ballroom was all crystal chandeliers and hushed string music, and quiet conversations between men who could ruin lives with a phone call, and Emma muttered under her breath, "This isn't a party, it's a very expensive funeral where nobody's died yet," and made a careful, determined path toward the bar, which was the one place in the room she understood. She almost made it. She was perhaps 3 steps away when her treacherous left heel found a slick patch of polished marble and decided, with no warning whatsoever, to stop cooperating with the laws of physics, and Emma felt the world tilt, her arms windmilling for balance in a way that would have been comical if it were happening to literally anyone else, and her flailing hand caught the edge of a passing waiter's tray. 6 flutes of champagne launched into the air in graceful, glittering arcs, and time seemed to slow as the whole shining cascade sailed directly toward Michael Rossi, who was standing a few feet away in a black tuxedo, mid-conversation with a circle of investors. The entire ballroom seemed to inhale at once. And Michael, without so much as glancing down, moved, a single economical shift of his body that Emma would think about for a long time afterward, the reflex of a man whose survival had always depended on seeing danger a half-second before it arrived, and the champagne crashed harmlessly to the marble at his feet, soaking nothing but the floor and the toes of his very expensive shoes. Silence fell over the ballroom, thick and absolute, the kind of silence that gathers around a person who has just done something unforgivable in a room full of people who do unforgivable things for a living. Emma stood frozen in the middle of the wreckage, glass glittering around her red hem, her face gone as bright as her dress, waiting for the explosion, waiting to be quietly and permanently removed from the guest list of the living. Every eye in the room was on Michael, watching to see what the coldest man in the city would do to the woman who had just made a spectacle of him in front of everyone who mattered. Michael looked at her. He looked at the broken glass scattered across the marble, at the champagne still dripping from the edge of the ruined tray, at the terror she was failing to hide behind a wobbling attempt at a smile, and then he did the one thing no one in that ballroom expected, the one thing Emma herself expected least of all. He stepped forward, past the shards, closing the distance between them, and asked, very quietly, so quietly that only she could hear it beneath the returning murmur of the crowd, "Are you hurt? Did you cut your hand on any of the glass?" Emma blinked up at him, so thrown by the question that she forgot to be embarrassed. What?" "The glass," he repeated, and there was something in his voice she had not heard before. something almost gentle buried under the granite. "Did you cut yourself?" She looked down at her hands, turning them over, genuinely surprised to find them whole. No, I don't think so." Michael gave a small nod, signaled a waiter with 2 fingers to clean the mess, and then, to the visible astonishment of the entire ballroom, offered Emma his arm. "Come with me," he said. "It's too loud in here." And as he led her away from the staring crowd, toward the quiet of a balcony, Emma realized that the most dangerous man in Chicago had just, in front of everyone, chosen to worry about her hands instead of his pride. The balcony was a different world, cool and dim and blessedly quiet. The city spread out below them in a carpet of amber lights, and the string quartet's music drifted out through the tall glass doors, softened to something almost tender. And Emma leaned gratefully against the stone railing and let out a breath she felt like she had been holding since she put on the heels. Michael stood beside her, not too close, his eyes on the skyline, and for a while neither of them spoke, until Emma noticed something she was certain no one else in that ballroom would ever have noticed: the way his right hand rested on the railing and his fingers moved, just slightly, pressing down in small, precise patterns, in time with the music floating out from inside, the fingers of a man who was not merely listening to the melody, but playing it, silently, against cold stone. "You play," she said softly. "The violin, don't you?" Michael's hand went abruptly still, and he turned to look at her with something guarded and startled in his expression. "Why would you say that?" "Because your fingers were playing along just now, whether you wanted them to or not," she said. "People who only listen to music tap their feet. People who used to make it, their hands never really forget." For a long moment she thought he would deny it, or simply walk back inside, but instead he looked back out at the city and said, in a voice lower and rougher than she had heard from him before, "I did. When I was a boy, there was a violin in the house, and a teacher who came on Thursdays, and for a few years it was the only thing I ever did that felt like it belonged to me, and no one else." He paused. "Then my mother decided it was a waste. She said a Rossi does not need sentimental little hobbies. That softness was a door other people walk through to hurt you." The teacher stopped coming. The violin went into a case, and the case went somewhere I never saw again. Emma felt a small ache in her chest. "That's one of the saddest things I've ever heard, and I've heard some genuinely sad things." "It's just the way I was raised," he said. "You should start again," she said quietly. "People with a gift shouldn't leave it locked in a case, just because someone once told them softness was dangerous. Whoever told you that was wrong, by the way. Deeply, completely wrong." Michael turned to look at her then, and whatever he might have said next was lost, because the balcony door swung open and a man stumbled out, glass in hand, a capo named Derek Shaw whom Emma had noticed earlier watching her from across the ballroom in a way that made her skin crawl, and he was drunk now, loose and grinning in a way that had nothing kind in it. "There she is," Derek slurred, stepping too close. "The little accountant in the red dress. You clean up nice for a girl who came here in a broken-down car. How about you leave the boss to his brooding and come dance with me?" Emma took a step back, her spine hitting the railing. "No thank you," she said, keeping her voice even. Derek reached out anyway, his fingers closing around her wrist. "Come on, don't be shy, I don't bite unless..." And he never finished the sentence, because Michael Rossi had moved between them so fast and so silently that Derek's drunken grin froze on his face, and Michael's hand closed over Derek's forearm, and his voice, when it came, was quiet and flat and colder than anything Emma had ever heard, a voice with no anger in it at all, which somehow made it far more frightening. "Take your hand off her. Now." Derek let go instantly, the color draining from his face, mumbling something that might have been an apology, and Michael did not move, did not blink, until Derek had backed away through the glass doors and vanished into the crowd. Only then did Michael turn to Emma, the ice in his eyes replaced by something searching and unguarded. "Did he hurt you?" "No," Emma said, rubbing her wrist even though it was fine, her heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with fear now. "Thank you for not leaving me out here alone with him." Michael looked at her for a long, quiet moment, the music still playing behind them, and said, almost as if the words surprised him, "Thank you for reminding me there are still things in this world worth protecting." And neither of them stepped back. The Monday after the gala, Emma arrived at the underground office to find the whole building wrapped in a strange, brittle tension, and Tony, driving her in that morning, had muttered only 2 words by way of explanation: "The mother," in the tone of a man reporting an incoming storm. Diana Rossi, it turned out, had flown into Chicago, and she was exactly the sort of woman Emma might have invented if asked to imagine the person who had raised a man like Michael, silver hair swept into an immaculate knot, a rope of pearls at her throat, and a way of looking at everyone as though she were quietly calculating their resale value. Emma had been summoned upstairs to deliver a report, and she walked in on the tail end of an argument, or rather on Diana delivering a verdict while Michael stood rigid by the window like a man bracing against a wind. "Her name is Catherine Ashford," Diana was saying. "Her father controls half the ports on the eastern seaboard. She is elegant, she is discreet, and a marriage would secure an alliance this family has needed for a decade. I have arranged a lunch. You will be charming." Michael's jaw was tight. "Mother, I've told you, I'm not interested in being traded like a shipping contract." "You are 34 years old," Diana replied coolly, "and this family does not run on your interests." And it was in that cornered, desperate moment, with his mother's expectation bearing down on him like a closing door, that Michael did something Emma would replay in her head for days afterward, because his eyes flicked across the room and landed on her standing frozen in the doorway, with a folder clutched to her chest, and he heard himself say, in a voice that was steadier than he had any right to be, "That won't be necessary." "I'm already seeing someone." The room went utterly silent. Diana turned, following her son's gaze, and fixed Emma with a look that could have frozen a lake. "Seeing someone," she repeated. "Since when? Who?" And Michael, having leapt off the cliff, had no choice but to keep falling. "Her name is Emma," he said. "Emma Carter." Emma nearly dropped the folder. Diana looked her up and down slowly, taking in the crooked dinosaur bandage on her forehead, the coffee stain on her sleeve, the entire unpolished disaster of her, and said, in a voice like the tapping of a manicured nail on glass, "I see. Then I should very much like to meet her properly. Lunch? Friday. Both of you." And she swept out of the room, leaving behind a silence so heavy, Emma could barely breathe through it. The moment the elevator doors closed on his mother, Michael turned to Emma with something close to panic behind his composure, and Emma found her voice at last. "You," she said, pointing the folder at him accusingly, "just used me as a human shield against your own mother." "I panicked," he admitted, running a hand through his hair, the first genuinely human gesture she had ever seen him make. "You heard her. She was planning a wedding to a woman I've never met. I needed her to stop, and you were the first thing I saw." "The first thing you saw?" Emma echoed, torn between outrage and a treacherous flicker of something warmer. "That's flattering." "Help me," he said, and it cost him something to say it. She could tell. "One lunch. Play along. Just once. So she leaves this alone, and I'll pay whatever you want." Emma folded her arms. "I don't want your money for lying to your mother. That feels wrong on about 6 different levels." But even as she said it, her mind was already somewhere else, on a phone call from the night before, her younger sister Lily's voice bright and careful on the line, telling her not to worry, that she could defer the nursing program another year, that she didn't mind waiting, and Emma had lain awake afterward doing the math she could never make work no matter how she arranged the numbers. She took a slow breath. "There is one thing," she said quietly. "My sister. She got into a nursing program, and there's no way on earth I can cover the tuition. Not the debt, not money for me. Just her. You cover Lily's school, and I'll be the most convincing girlfriend your mother has ever met." Michael studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened at the fact that the price she named was not for herself at all. "Done," he said. Friday arrived far too quickly, and Emma stood outside the restaurant in her one good dress, a modest navy thing borrowed from a neighbor, running through the story she and Michael had agreed on, which was that they had met through work, and things had grown from there. A story that had the distinct advantage of being almost true, and Michael appeared at her side looking as composed as ever, murmuring, "Just be calm, don't volunteer anything, and for the love of God, try not to knock anything over." Emma knocked over her water glass within the first 90 seconds of sitting down. And Diana was waiting at a table by the window, pearls in place, spine straight as a blade, and she watched the water spread across the white tablecloth with an expression of refined horror, while Emma mopped frantically at it with her napkin, then bent to retrieve a fork she had somehow also dislodged, and cracked her head smartly on the underside of the table on the way back up. "Sorry," Emma gasped, rubbing her skull and going scarlet. I'm a little nervous, and also I'm just like this all the time, so you might as well get used to it now rather than later." Diana's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch, and she began her interrogation the way a surgeon begins an operation, precisely and without warmth. "Emma, what is it you do?" "I'm a forensic accountant," Emma said, which was safely true. "And you studied where?" "I didn't finish, actually," Emma admitted, and she felt Michael tense beside her, but she pressed on, because lying to this woman felt more dangerous than the truth. "My parents died when I was 19, in a car accident, and I had a little sister to raise, so college became the thing I gave up instead of the thing I finished. I don't regret it. I learned more about numbers keeping the two of us fed on nothing than I ever did in a lecture hall." Diana was quiet for a moment, and something flickered across her carefully arranged face. Surprise, perhaps, at being answered with the truth instead of a performance. "And your family now?" "My sister Lily. She's 21. She's studying to be a nurse. She's the best thing I ever did, and I didn't even do it on purpose. I just refused to let the world have her." Emma smiled, unguarded. "She's the reason for basically everything, honestly." The lunch went on like that, Emma stumbling and blushing and knocking her spoon off the table, but answering every question Diana fired at her with a plain honesty that clearly the older woman was entirely unaccustomed to, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the temperature at the table began to change. And then, reaching for the small vase of roses at the center of the table, to move it aside so she could see Michael better, Diana caught the pad of her thumb on a thorn and drew back with a small, sharp hiss, a bright bead of red welling up on her immaculate hand. Before anyone could react, before Emma's brain could remind her whose company she was in, her hand had already dived into her bag on pure reflex, the way it had 1,000 times before, and come out clutching her collection, and she was leaning across the table asking, with complete sincerity, "Do you want a panda or a unicorn?" The table went silent. Michael closed his eyes as though praying. Diana Rossi, a woman before whom capos trembled, and rival bosses chose their words with care, a woman no one in living memory had dared to offer a cartoon bandage, stared at the fistful of colorful stickers being extended toward her wounded thumb, and something happened in her face that Michael had not seen in years. "Unicorn," Diana said finally, and held out her hand. Emma carefully pressed the little unicorn bandage over the tiny wound, smoothing it down with the gentleness of long practice, and Diana looked down at the ridiculous rainbow thing on her 60-year-old hand and did not remove it. When Emma excused herself a few minutes later to find the restroom, tripping only slightly on the chair leg, Diana turned to her son and said, in a low voice, "She's not performing. I have sat across from 100 women who wanted something from this family, and every one of them wore a mask. That girl doesn't own one." She paused, studying the unicorn on her thumb. "It's been a very long time since anyone at my table was simply real. Don't you dare let her turn out to be like the rest." It was nearly midnight, and Emma was still at the office, or rather in the private study on the upper floor where she had taken to working late because the ledgers were too sensitive to leave her sight and, if she was honest with herself, because she had begun to prefer the quiet hours, when the building emptied and it felt almost peaceful. When she heard the side door open and close with a sound that was wrong, too heavy, too careful, and then footsteps that did not have their usual measured confidence. She came out into the hall and found Michael leaning against the wall, one arm braced against it, his face gray beneath the low light, and even in the dimness she could see the dark stain spreading slow and terrible across the side of his white shirt. "Michael," she breathed, crossing to him in 3 quick steps. "You're bleeding. What happened? We need to call someone. We need a doctor. Right now." "No doctor," he said through gritted teeth, and even wounded his voice held that cold command. "A deal went wrong. Someone wanted me gone. If I call a doctor, then a doctor knows I was hurt. And if a doctor knows, then someone knows. And right now I cannot afford for anyone to know that I bleed." He tried to straighten and swayed, and Emma caught him, sliding her shoulder under his arm, staggering under the sudden weight of him. "Okay," she said, fighting to keep her voice level, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "Okay, no doctor, but you are absolutely not doing the tough guy thing where you pretend you're fine and fall over dead in a hallway. So sit down right here." She eased him down against the wall, and her hands were shaking as she pulled his ruined shirt aside enough to see, and it was bad, worse than she had any training for. Emma fumbled for her phone, made the call to Tony, gasped out the words, and then hung up and turned back to Michael, whose eyes were beginning to lose their focus. She knew 10 minutes was a long time, and that something had to hold until then. She didn't hesitate. This bookish woman who fainted at the sight of her own paper cuts pressed both her bare hands hard against the ruined fabric of his shirt, using her entire body weight to hold the worst of it closed. Her hands were slick and trembling, but she didn't pull away. "Stay with me. Stay awake. You don't get to check out on me tonight. Do you hear me?" she whispered fiercely. Michael, drifting at the edge of consciousness, looked up at the woman who was kneeling in the dark, crying and refusing to admit it, ruining her clothes and her hands to keep his blood inside him. A breath that was almost a laugh escaped him, thin and pained. "You're ruining your dress, Emma," he rasped. "It's a cheap dress," Emma said, her voice cracking on the edge of hysteria and tenderness both. "And if you die on me, Michael Rossi, I'm billing your estate for the dry cleaning. So keep your eyes open, keep looking at me," and she kept talking, kept him tethered with the steady, frantic warmth of her voice, her hands never leaving his side, pressing down with an exhausted, stubborn strength, until at last the door burst open and Tony arrived with the kit. Dropping to his knees beside them, Tony took over with practiced hands, glancing in disbelief at the pale, trembling woman who hadn't let go until she was forced to. Michael's eyes, growing heavy now that help had come, stayed fixed on Emma, on the tear tracks she hadn't bothered to wipe, on the woman who had knelt in his blood without being asked, and had not once looked away. Hours later, when Tony had done what he could and gone to make quiet arrangements, and the power had been cut throughout the upper floors as a precaution against anyone watching the building for signs of life, Emma sat on the floor of the study beside Michael in the wavering light of a single candle she had found in a drawer. Refusing to leave, and he was propped against the base of the sofa, pale and bandaged and stripped of all the armor he usually wore, and in that soft, unsteady glow, he did not look like the most dangerous man in Chicago at all. He looked like someone's tired, frightened son. For a long while neither of them spoke, and then Michael, staring into the small flame, said quietly, "My father died when I was 19. I was standing close enough to catch him when he fell. One moment he was telling me about a shipment, laughing about something, and the next he was gone, and the men who did it were people he trusted, people who had eaten at our table." Emma said nothing, only turned to listen, because she understood that some things had to be let out slowly, or not at all. "My mother told me at the funeral that I had a choice," he went on. "I could grieve, or I could survive, but I could not do both, and that a Rossi who let people close was simply a Rossi who had not yet been betrayed. His fingers moved absently against his knee. That same silent phantom music. I believed her. And then, when I was 24, I stopped believing her for a while, because there was a woman, and I let her in, all the way in, and it turned out she had been sent. She fed everything I told her to men who wanted the family gone. So I learned the lesson properly the second time. To need someone is to hand them the knife and turn around. I decided I would rather be alone forever than ever turn around again. Emma was quiet for a moment, and then she said, softly, "You're not cold, Michael. Everyone thinks you're cold, but that's not it at all. You're careful. There's an enormous difference between a person with no warmth and a person guarding what warmth they have left, because the last people who touched it burned them. Cold is empty. You're not empty. You're just standing very far back from your own fire, so no one can throw water on it." Michael turned his head and looked at her. Really looked, in that candlelight, and the distance between them had become very small without either of them deciding it should, and his eyes moved to her mouth, and hers to his, and the whole silent room seemed to lean in with them. And then he stopped. He drew back, just slightly, the discipline of 15 years reasserting itself even now. Even here. "Emma," he said, his voice rough. "Everyone who gets close to me ends up paying for it. I won't be the reason something happens to you." Emma let out a breath, and rather than argue, rather than push, Emma let out a breath, and rather than argue, rather than push, she reached into her bag, her hands finally scrubbed clean but still shaking slightly, and pulled out a small, ordinary Panda bandage, turning it over in her fingers in the candlelight like a habit of comfort, and she smiled a little sadly. "You know, I have this theory I've never been able to solve. My whole life, my mother stuffed these things into my pockets, my backpack, my lunch bag, everywhere, because she swore I'd hurt myself. And I always did. So I've never figured out the real order of things." She held it up to the flame. "Am I clumsy because the universe knew I always had a bandage ready, so it decided I might as well use them? Or did my mother just take one look at her hopeless daughter and know she'd better send the poor kid out into the world armed for the inevitable?" She laughed quietly. I'll never know which came first, but either way, she made sure that no matter how many times I fell, I always had something to patch myself up with and keep going. She looked at him then, steady and unafraid. "That's all I'm trying to say to you. Getting hurt isn't the thing to be afraid of. Everybody gets hurt. The only thing that matters is whether you've got something to patch yourself up with afterward, and whether you're willing to let anybody hand you the bandage." Michael looked at her for a very long time, and did not answer, but he did not move away again either. In the days that followed, while Michael recovered behind closed doors, and the family held its breath, Emma threw herself into the ledgers with a new and desperate focus. Because someone had tried to kill the man, she was no longer able to pretend she felt nothing for, and every instinct she owned told her the answer was buried in the numbers she had been living inside for weeks. She started where she always started, with the maintenance fee she had flagged that very first day, the 2-round payment bleeding out of the warehouse account month after month, and this time, she did not stop at noticing it was wrong. She followed it, pulling the thread patiently through a labyrinth of shell entries and false invoices and accounts that folded into other accounts like a nest of paper boxes, and what she found at the center of it made her go very cold and very still on the floor of the study, the same stillness that came over her whenever the numbers finally spoke. The money had not simply been stolen. It had been stolen and then carefully arranged to point somewhere, and as Emma traced the trail forward instead of backward, following not where the money came from but where the evidence was being made to lead, she realized with a sick lurch that every false thread had been laid down to converge on a single conclusion, that there was a mole inside the Rossi family feeding information and money to the authorities, and that the trail had been constructed, deliberately and with terrible skill, to make that mole appear to be her. Whoever had built this had been building it for months, since long before she arrived, and had simply waited, And when a debt-ridden outsider with no allies and no way to prove her own history walked through the door, they had found the perfect person to hang it on. There was a meeting logged with a contact from outside the family, timed to a night she had stayed late alone, a payment routed through an account opened in a name suspiciously close to hers, a dozen small poisoned details, each one meaningless alone, but damning when stacked together. And worst of all, worst of everything, it had all been shaped to strike Michael exactly where he was weakest, at the oldest wound he had, the one he had shown her by candlelight, the certainty burned into him since he was 19 that the people closest to you are the ones who hold the knife. Whoever had done this knew that story, knew that Michael Rossi would not need to be convinced, that a part of him would want to believe it, because believing it would prove the terrible lesson right and let him retreat behind the wall she had spent weeks coaxing him out from behind. And then Emma found the seam, one entry too clean, one hand too practiced in the forgery, a single tiny signature of technique that repeated across the fabricated documents like a fingerprint the forger had not known he was leaving, and when she cross-referenced that technique against the real ledgers, the ones going back years, it matched the work of exactly one man, a man who had every reason to want Michael gone, so he could take what Michael had. A man who had grabbed her wrist on a balcony and been humiliated in front of everyone. Derek Shaw. Emma sat back on her heels, her heart pounding, understanding all at once the full and horrifying shape of it, that Derek had been draining the family for months, that he had framed her to cover his own tracks and to remove her as the one person clever enough to unravel it, and that the attempt on Michael's life had been the next step, the acceleration, the beginning of the endgame. She had to tell him. She had to gather every page, every trace, every thread, and lay it all in front of Michael before Derek could move first. And she began to work faster than she ever had, pulling documents, making copies, building the case that would clear her name and save the man she loved, her hands moving with frantic precision. But even as she worked, some cold, quiet part of her, the part that had learned young that the world does not wait for you to be ready, whispered that she was not fast enough, that a trap this patient, and this cruel, would not have been left with a door for her to escape through, and that somewhere in the building, Derek Shaw was already reaching to spring it. She was almost finished assembling the case, gathering the last of the copied documents into a folder she intended to place in Michael's hands that very night, when she came across something that stopped her cold for an entirely different reason, a wire transfer, buried among the family's legitimate expenditures, dated 2 weeks earlier, routed to a nursing college 3 states away, paid in full, tuition and housing and books, made out in her sister's name, Lily Carter, with no note, no acknowledgement, no request for thanks attached to it anywhere. Emma sat staring at the entry for a long time. Michael had never mentioned it. He had made the deal with her in a moment of panic, had agreed to cover Lily's schooling as the price of a lie, and then he had simply done it, quietly, completely, weeks ago, without ever once bringing it up, without using it to hold anything over her, without letting her see the receipt so she might feel indebted, without any of the small transactional cruelties she had braced herself to expect from a man who moved money for a living. He had given her sister a future and said nothing, because he had wanted the giving to be the whole of it, and Emma pressed her hand to her mouth and felt something break open and warm in her chest, because she understood then that the coldest man in Chicago had learned somewhere in his ruined childhood that love spoken aloud was a weakness others could exploit, and so he had done the only thing he knew how to do, which was to love in silence, in ledgers, in wire transfers no one was ever supposed to see. She found him in the study a little while later, and she did not have the folder of evidence in her hands yet. She had left it, meaning to bring it, meaning to tell him everything, but the sight of him standing there by the window in the late afternoon light drove every careful word out of her head, and instead, she crossed the room and said, her voice thick, "You paid for Lily's school. All of it, 2 weeks ago, and you never said a word." Michael did not turn from the window right away. It wasn't meant to be found, he said. I know, Emma whispered. That's exactly why I can't stop thinking about it. He faced her then, and something in his usual composure had come loose, and for a moment they simply stood there looking at each other across a small, unbearable distance. And Emma felt the whole shape of the last weeks press down on her at once. The coffee, and the balcony, and the candlelight, and the blood on the floor, and now this quiet, enormous kindness he had tried to hide. And she took a step toward him, and he did not step back. Michael, she said softly, I need to tell you something. About the ledgers. About what I found. It's important, and it can't wait. But first, I need to say, and she got no further, because his hand had come up to the side of her face, hesitant, unpracticed, as though he had forgotten how to touch someone gently, and was relearning it in that instant. And the whole world narrowed to the few inches of warm air between them, and for the first time since the iron gate had clanged shut behind her on her very first day, Emma Carter felt utterly, terrifyingly safe. And that was the exact moment the study door burst open. Tony stood in the doorway, his face gray and stricken, breathing hard as though he had run the whole length of the building, and behind him in the hall there were more footsteps, many of them, heavy, and purposeful, and wrong, and Tony's eyes went straight to Emma with an expression that made her blood turn to ice, an expression of warning and apology and dread all at once, and he said the words that shattered the fragile warmth of the room like glass. Michael. The council's been called. Derek Shaw called it. He's got evidence, he says, that there's a traitor in the family. His gaze did not leave Emma. He's naming her. They brought her down to the long room beneath the main house where the family had settled its gravest matters for 3 generations. A windowless chamber with a heavy table and hard faces ranged around it. And Emma was made to stand at one end of it like the accused she was, while the men who held the fates of others in their hands looked at her with the flat, assessing eyes of people deciding how much of a problem she represented. Derek Shaw stood at the other end, and he had transformed himself entirely from the sloppy drunk of the balcony into something composed and grave and convincing, a loyal soldier reluctantly bringing terrible news, and he laid his case out on the table one document at a time, and Emma watched her own destruction assembled in front of her with a horrible, helpless clarity, because she, of all people, could see how well it had been built. Here was the record of a meeting with a contact outside the family, timed to a night she had been alone in the building. Here was an account, opened in a name a hair's breadth from her own, through which money had moved to the very authorities circling the family. Here were copies of sensitive ledgers, the kind only she had been given access to. Found, Derek said gravely, in a search of the places she worked. Here was motive, a woman crushed by debt, desperate, with every reason to sell the family that owned her to the people who would pay to bring it down. Each piece meant nothing by itself, and Emma opened her mouth to say exactly that, to explain that she had found the real trail, that Derek himself was the forger, that the evidence in this very room bore his fingerprints if they would only let her show them. But every time she began, the men talked over her, because she was the outsider, the stranger, the debtor, and Derek was one of their own, and the story he told fit the world they understood far better than the truth she was trying to offer. And then the room went quiet, because Michael had entered, still moving carefully from the wound none of them officially knew about, and every eye turned to him, because in the end there was only one voice in that room that mattered, only one man whose word would decide whether Emma Carter walked out of the basement or did not. And Emma turned to him too, and she waited, and she believed. God help her, she believed, because he had paid for Lily's school in silence. After all, he had let her see him by candlelight. After all, his hand had been on her face not 1 hour ago. Michael stood at the head of the table and looked at the evidence, and looked at Derek, and looked at last at Emma, and Emma saw the war happening behind his eyes, saw the old wound tearing open, saw the 19-year-old boy who had caught his father as he fell, and the 24-year-old man who had let a woman in and been sold for it, and she understood with dawning horror that the trap had been built precisely for this moment, that Derek had not needed to convince Michael of anything, only to remind him of what he had always been most afraid was true, that everyone who gets close to you is holding the knife. She saw him want to believe it. She saw that believing it was easier, safer, that it would prove the lesson right, and let him climb back behind the wall where nothing could ever reach him again. And she saw the exact instant the fear won, the instant his face closed like a door, and the warmth went out of his eyes, and the man she had been slowly uncovering disappeared back inside the stranger she had first met. "She's an accountant," Michael said, and his voice was flat and cold and final, each word landing like a stone dropped down a well. "I brought her in to do a job. That is all she ever was. There is nothing between us, and there never was." The room seemed to exhale, satisfied, the matter settled by the only authority that counted, and Emma stood very still at the end of the long table, feeling something inside her chest fold quietly and completely in half. Not with a scream, not with tears, just a small, silent collapse. The sound a person makes when the one thing they had let themselves hope for is taken away by the last hand they ever expected to take it. He would not look at her. That, somehow, was the part that broke her. For a long moment Emma did not move, and the men around the table waited to see what the outsider would do, now that the verdict had been spoken, whether she would weep, or beg, or throw herself at Michael's feet and plead, because that was what they had all seen before from people cornered in this room. And it would have been so easy, the begging, the tears, the desperate insistence that they had it all wrong. But Emma Carter had spent her whole life being knocked down by people with more power than her, and she had learned somewhere along the way that the one thing they could never take from you, the one thing that was always yours to keep, was the manner in which you stood back up. So she lifted her chin, and when she spoke, her voice did not shake, which surprised even her. "I found the real trail," she said quietly to the room, not to Michael, because Michael had made it clear she was no longer allowed to speak to him. "Everything on that table was built to point at me, by someone who's been robbing this family for months, and needed a stranger to blame it on. I know who it is. I can prove it. And the fact that not one of you will look closely enough to see how badly you're being played is exactly why he chose this family, and exactly why he'll do it again after I'm gone." She let that sit for a moment in the silence. "I'm not going to beg. I've been broke. I've been betrayed. I've buried the only two people who ever truly loved me, and I raised a child while I was still a child myself, and I did all of it without begging a single person for anything. So I'm certainly not going to start in a basement, in front of men who'd rather believe a comfortable lie than do the hard work of finding an inconvenient truth." She reached down, gathered her worn bag from the floor, and as she straightened, some old reflex older than thought moved her hand into it, and she drew out a bandage, a small bright dinosaur, and pressed it onto the side of her finger, over skin that was not cut, that was not bleeding, that had no wound on it at all, an automatic gesture of self-repair, performed by a body that had simply run out of other ways to hold itself together. And this time, nobody in the room laughed. This time, the sight of that ridiculous little bandage on an uninjured finger landed in the chest of every man there like something unbearably sad, because they understood, without being able to say it, that they were watching a person patch a wound that was nowhere they could see it. Emma looked at Michael one last time, and he was staring at the table, at the evidence, at anything but her, and she nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself. "You told me the wall doesn't make you safe," she said softly. "It just makes you alone. I was wrong to think you'd ever want to hear that." And then she turned and walked the length of the long room and up the stairs, her back straight, her steps steady, and she did not look back, and she was gone. The room stayed silent after the door closed above them. Michael did not move, and in the quiet, Tony Marino, who had watched all of it with a face carved from stone, crossed slowly to where his boss stood, and, under the pretext of clasping his shoulder in solidarity, slipped something into the pocket of Michael's jacket. A single folded page Emma had left on the study desk in her rush to reach him. One page of many. Not the whole case. Not nearly enough to undo what had been done, but enough, if a man ever found the courage to read it, to plant one small terrible seed of doubt. One thread that whispered she had been telling the truth. Tony said nothing. He simply held Michael's gaze for a moment, long enough to be sure the weight of the page would be felt, and then he stepped back into his place and left his boss alone with the silence he had chosen. It was near dawn before Michael found the folded page in his pocket, sitting alone in the dark study where hours earlier her hand had been on his face, and when he unfolded it and began to read, the cold accountant's precision of her handwriting laid out a single thread of the trail she had tried to give him, one clean line of reasoning tracing a payment back through a forged invoice to a technique of forgery, and even this fragment, even this one page torn from a case he had refused to hear, was enough, because he had built an empire on his ability to read men and money, and he could see at a glance that it was true, that the work was genuine, that the woman he had condemned in front of his family had been innocent, had in fact been trying to save him at the very moment he was busy destroying her. He sat with the page in his hands for a long time, and did not move. He did not think about the woman who had betrayed him a decade ago, did not reach for the old story to comfort himself with, because the old story offered no comfort now. It offered only a mirror, and in that mirror he saw something he could not bear to look at directly. All his life he had believed himself the one who had been betrayed, the boy who caught his father as he fell, the man who had been sold by someone he loved, and he had built every wall he owned on that foundation, on the certainty that he was the one who got hurt, the one who had learned. But he had not been the betrayed tonight. Tonight, for the first time, he had been the betrayer. A person had walked into his life with nothing but honesty and a stubborn warmth that asked for nothing, had knelt in his blood and used her bare hands to keep him tethered to the world, had told his mother the truth when a lie would have served her better. And when the moment came to choose between protecting that person and protecting himself, he had done the one thing done to him that had ruined his whole life. He had chosen the wall. He had handed her to the wolves and turned around, and the terrible symmetry of it settled over him like a slow suffocation. In the days that followed, the empire ran exactly as it always had. The money moved, the meetings happened, the men reported and were dismissed, and Michael sat at the center of it all like a man at the bottom of a well, going through motions that produced no meaning, and he found that he could not taste his coffee, black, and exact the way he had always insisted on, because he kept thinking of the ridiculous sweet thing she had once put in front of him, and how he had pretended to hate it, and the silence of his enormous cold apartment, which he had chosen and defended for 15 years, had stopped being peaceful and become simply empty, an emptiness with a shape now, a shape exactly the size of a clumsy woman who was no longer in it. It was Diana who finally said it aloud. She came to the study and found him staring at nothing, and she did not offer sympathy, because she was not a woman who trafficked in it. She simply stood in the doorway and looked at her son with the clear, pitiless honesty she had spent her whole life perfecting, and she said, "I told you once not to let her turn out to be like the rest. I was wrong to warn you against her. I should have warned you against yourself." Michael did not answer. "She was the only real thing that ever walked into this house," Diana went on, her voice quiet and terrible. "The only person who ever came to our table wanting nothing, and you had her thrown out on the word of a man you have never trusted, because it was easier than being brave. You did not lose her, Michael, you drove her out. There is a difference, and you of all people should know exactly what it is." And she left him there, with the folded page and the cold coffee and the empty room, and for the first time in 15 years, Michael Rossi understood that the wall he had built to keep the pain out had, in the end, only ever sealed it inside with him. It took Tony 2 days to find her, because Emma had not gone home, and when he told Michael where she was, at a dog rescue on the ragged edge of the city, a place she had apparently been going to volunteer because, In her own words to the woman who ran it, she needed something that would love her back without asking for anything. Michael left the meeting he was in mid-sentence and drove himself out there, alone, with a bouquet of pink peonies bought from the first shop he passed, and a speech he had rehearsed a dozen times and could no longer remember a word of. The rescue was a low, muddy sprawl of pens and fencing, and Michael, in his black tailored suit and mirror-polished shoes, looked so absurdly out of place that a volunteer actually laughed when he asked for Emma and pointed him toward the back, where the hard cases were kept, and he found her sitting in the middle of a fenced enclosure in the dirt, in old jeans and a filthy sweatshirt, cradling a scruffy three-legged dog in her lap and murmuring to it, and the sight of her, muddy and tired and gentle, undid something in his chest he had spent his whole life holding together. "Emma," he said. She looked up, and her face went hard and shuddered the instant she saw him. "You're not supposed to be here. I need to talk to you." "There's nothing to talk about," she said, turning back to the dog. "Waffle here got abandoned by people who decided he wasn't useful anymore, so we understand each other." The words landed exactly where she had aimed them. Michael opened the gate and stepped into the enclosure, holding the flowers out in front of him like a shield, and he took one step across the mud toward her, and the polished shoes that had never once slipped on a marble floor found no purchase whatsoever in wet clay, and Michael Rossi, the most powerful man in Chicago, went down hard and graceless into the mud, flat on his back, the peonies launching out of his hand and scattering their petals across the muck. And Waffle, delighted, scrambled off Emma's lap on his 3 good legs and flung himself onto the fallen man, seizing the end of Michael's very expensive tie in his teeth and worrying it with joyful ferocity. "Waffle, no," Emma said, but there was a crack in her voice that was not entirely anger, because it is genuinely difficult to stay furious at a man lying flat in the dirt while a 3-legged dog destroys his tie. Michael did not get up. He lay there for a moment in the mud, and then he pushed himself up onto his knees, straw and muck clinging to the ruined suit, the dog still attached to his tie, and he looked at her from down in the dirt where he had landed, and whatever speech he had rehearsed was gone, and what came out instead was only the truth. "I was a coward," he said. "You were trying to save me, and I threw you to them because it was easier than being brave, because believing the worst of you let me hide behind the same wall that's ruined my entire life. And the moment you were gone, I understood I had done the exact thing to you that was once done to me. You knelt in my blood, Emma. You secured your sister's future and asked for nothing for yourself. You are the only person in 15 years who ever looked straight through me and stayed, and I repaid you by handing you to a liar. I don't deserve for you to forgive me, but I could not let another day pass without kneeling in front of you, apparently quite literally, and telling you that you were right about everything, and that I am so deeply sorry." Emma stared at him, this man she had watched command rooms with a whisper, now on his knees in the mud with a dog gnawing his tie and mud in his hair, apologizing with more raw honesty than she had ever heard from him behind any polished desk, and slowly, wordlessly, she reached into her bag and drew out 2 bandages and leaned across the fence to press a small dinosaur onto Waffle's scarred foreleg, and then, after a long pause, a panda onto the back of Michael's mud-streaked hand. "One condition," she said, her voice unsteady. "Next time someone accuses me, you defend me, out loud, in front of everyone, no hesitation." Michael looked down at the panda on his hand. "Deal," he said. Emma had not yet given Michael an answer about anything beyond the one condition, had not decided whether a panda on a muddy hand meant forgiveness or merely a truce, when everything came apart at once, because Derek Shaw had never intended to stop at framing her, and with her cast out, and Michael wounded and distracted, he made his true move, accelerating the endgame he had been building for months. Feeding the authorities exactly enough real information to trigger a raid while simultaneously whispering to a rival family that the Rossi empire was leaderless and ripe, so that in the space of a single day, Michael found himself fighting a fire on 2 fronts, the law closing in on the family's holdings with warrants, and the rival Moreno faction moving on Rossi territory. A genuine crisis that pulled him and every man he had into the streets and the boardrooms to hold the empire together. And it was in the middle of that chaos, watching from the small apartment where she had been staying, that Emma saw the news of the raid and understood two things with perfect cold clarity. The first being that Derek was going to walk away clean while the entire family took the fall for crimes he had committed, and the second being the phone call she received an hour later, Derek's voice smooth and poisonous in her ear, telling her that he knew exactly where her sister went to nursing school now, that debts had a way of following families, and that she would be wise to stay quiet and disappear for good, and that, more than anything Michael had done or failed to do, was what brought Emma Carter down off the bench. She did not go back for Michael, she told herself, as she gathered the full case she had assembled and never gotten to present. The complete folder, every thread, every proof, the whole labyrinth unraveled and laid bare. She went back, because she had buried her pride for no man, and she would bury it for no criminal either, and because Derek Shaw had made the single gravest mistake of his life, when he put her sister's name in his mouth. She walked into the emergency council of the Rossi family uninvited, past men too stunned to stop her, and she set her folder on the long table where she had once been condemned, and this time she did not let them talk over her. One document at a time, exactly as Derek had done to her, she took his lie apart, showing them the forger's fingerprint that repeated across every fabricated page, tracing the stolen money not to the outsider they had blamed, but back through the maintenance fees and the shell accounts to Derek's own hand, laying out how he had drained the family for months, framed her to cover it, and then sold them all to the law and the Morenos the instant he thought the throne was empty. And then she did the thing none of them had thought possible. Because Emma Carter was not merely an accountant who could find dirty money, she could clean it, and in front of the council and, through a very careful arrangement Tony helped her broker, in front of the authorities themselves, she demonstrated how the family's legitimate holdings could be lawfully separated from Derek's poison trail, how the empire could shed the criminal weight he had hung around its neck and survive as something clean, the single most valuable restructuring anyone in that room had ever witnessed. A deal that did not just clear the family's name, but gave it a future none of them had imagined it could have. Derek came out of his chair with fury on his face, and a threat half formed on his lips. And that was the moment the door opened, and Michael Rossi walked in, mud long since washed away, moving with the cold, certain gravity that made rooms fall silent, and he crossed to stand beside Emma at the head of the table, and he did not look at the evidence. He looked at his counsel, and he said, in a voice that carried into every corner of the room, "This woman is telling the truth. I knew it days ago, and I said nothing, and I will carry that. But hear me now, every one of you. She is not an outsider. She is not a traitor. She is the only reason this family is still standing, and anyone who raises a hand or a word against her raises it against me." He turned then, finally, to Emma, in front of all of them, exactly as he had promised in the mud. "I should have said that in this room a week ago. I'm saying it now." With Derek handed to the authorities on the strength of the very evidence he had built to destroy her, and the Morenos withdrawing the moment they understood the Rossi family was neither leaderless nor vulnerable, and the empire beginning the slow, strange work of becoming something cleaner than it had ever been, Michael asked Emma, with a nervousness she had never once seen in him, whether she would come to dinner, not to discuss the ledgers, not to settle accounts, just dinner, and Emma, who had every reason in the world to say no, and only one reason to say yes, said yes. When she rang the bell at his penthouse that evening, she almost did not recognize the man who opened the door, because Michael Rossi was wearing dark jeans and a soft gray shirt with the sleeves pushed up, no jacket, no tie, no armor of any kind, and there was flour on his forearm, and something that smelled promising and slightly scorched drifting from the kitchen behind him. "You cooked," she said, genuinely astonished. "I attempted," he corrected, stepping back to let her in, and the enormous apartment she had imagined as cold and empty was scattered tonight with candles and low music, and the wreckage of a man who had clearly fought a losing battle with a recipe, and Emma looked around at all of it and felt her throat go tight. They sat, and it was awkward in a way that had nothing to do with the danger they had survived, and everything to do with the fact that neither of them knew how to do this, how to simply be two people at a table with no crisis to hide behind, and Michael kept pushing food around his plate, and finally Emma set down her fork and said gently, "You're doing the thing where you look like you're being interrogated." "Relax. It's just me. That's precisely the problem," he admitted. "I have no idea how to do this. Sit across from someone with no agenda, no leverage, nothing to manage. I've spent my whole life making sure no moment was ever this undefended." Emma considered him for a moment, and then she smiled and reached her hand across the table, palm up. "Then let's start over. From the very beginning, no basement, no ledgers, no debt." She cleared her throat. "Hi, I'm Emma. I'm hopelessly clumsy. I carry a truly unreasonable number of bandages, and I have a bad habit of telling powerful men exactly what I think of them." Michael looked at her outstretched hand for a long moment, and then he took it, and something in his shoulders came loose, that she suspected had been locked tight since he was 19 years old. "Hello, Emma," he said quietly. "I'm Michael. I used to play the violin. I don't know how to accept a kind gesture, and apparently, I have a weakness for women who walk into my life and refuse to be afraid of me." They talked for a long time after that, the awkwardness melting into something easier, and when the plates were cleared and they stood together in the kitchen in the candlelight, the small distance between them became no distance at all, and this time when he lifted his hand to the side of her face, there was no counsel waiting to shatter the moment. No wound bleeding on a floor, no wall left standing between them, and he kissed her, and it was not the desperate collision of people who might not survive the night. It was slow and certain and unbearably tender, the kiss of a man who had finally decided to stop being afraid. When they drew apart, Emma kept her eyes closed a moment longer, as if to be sure it was real, and Michael rested his forehead against hers and said the thing he had never in his life said to anyone. "I spent 34 years building walls," he murmured, "convinced that every one of them was keeping me alive. And you walked in with your bandages and your terrible sweet coffeezing, and you knocked every single one of them down without even seeming to try, and now I can't remember why they were ever there, or how I stood to live behind them for so long. I don't want them back, Emma. I can't even imagine them anymore." Emma opened her eyes, and they were wet, and she laughed the small broken laugh of someone who has stopped bracing for the next fall. "For the record," she whispered, "the coffee was never terrible. You were just scared of anything that tasted like happiness." "I know," he said. "Teach me anyway." A year can change a great deal, and it changed nearly everything, because the woman who had once been dragged through an iron gate over a dead man's debt now walked through the front doors of a gleaming downtown tower every morning as the head of the legitimate arm of what had once been the Rossi empire, and was now, thanks largely to her, a real and respectable holding company that paid its taxes and signed clean contracts, and had shed the darkness of its past the way a person sheds an old coat. Emma had done what no one believed possible, taken a fortune built in shadow and patiently, lawfully, brought it into the light, and along the way she had erased the last of her father's debt, as though it had never existed, and she had watched her sister Lily walk across a stage in a nursing cap, with tears streaming down her own face. The tuition long since paid, the future she had fought 8 years to protect finally, fully secured. She and Michael, it turned out, were even better together than they had been apart, which was saying something, and Michael had bought a violin, and some evenings she would come home to find him playing softly by the window, badly at first, and then less badly. The sound of a locked case finally opened after 20 years. It was at a gala much like the one where she had once launched 6 glasses of champagne at his head that Michael chose to do it, standing at a podium after being honored for the company's transformation, and instead of the speech everyone expected, He set down his notes and looked out at the crowd until he found her. And he said that everything he had become worth honoring, he had become because one impossibly clumsy, impossibly honest woman had walked into the darkest room of his life, carrying a bag full of bandages, and refused to leave until she had patched up not only his books, but his heart. And then Michael Rossi, in front of the most powerful people in Chicago, got down on one knee, or attempted to, because his tailored suit was cut so precisely that the moment he bent there was an audible and catastrophic tearing sound, and he wobbled, off balance, kneeling now at an angle that suggested a man attempting an unfamiliar yoga pose more than a marriage proposal, a ring box held aloft in one hand, and the seat of his very expensive trousers surrendered entirely. The ballroom gasped, and then Emma was laughing and crying at once as she rose from her seat and crossed to him, and she knelt beside him in her gown, and from her bag, the same worn bag she would carry to the end of her days, she drew out the legendary collection, selected a bright rainbow unicorn, and pressed it firmly over the ruined seam of his trousers, in front of 800 astonished guests. "There," she said, smoothing it down. "Patched. Now what was it you were about to ask me?" And Michael, kneeling in his torn suit with a unicorn bandage holding his dignity together, laughed the free, unguarded laugh of a man who no longer had anything to protect, and asked her, and she said yes before he had finished the question. They married 2 months later in a garden in the spring, and the ceremony was exactly the beautiful disaster anyone who knew them could have predicted, because the groom had left the rings in the car and had to sprint back for them while the guests waited, and the bride caught her heel in the hem of her dress, and was saved from falling only by Tony Marino's steady hand. And Waffle, the three-legged guest of honor, chose the exact moment of the vows to gallop joyfully down the length of the aisle, and Diana Rossi, who had once measured everyone by their resale value, cried so hard she ruined the makeup she had spent an hour applying, and did not care in the slightest. And when it was done, when they had promised to hold each other up through every fall still to come, one of the guests slipped on the garden path, and Emma's hand shot into her bag on pure reflex before she had even finished turning to look, and Michael caught her wrist gently and met her eyes, and the two of them dissolved into helpless laughter, because they both knew, they had always known, exactly who she was, and neither of them would have changed a single clumsy thing about her. Sometimes the thing that saves us is not power, and it is not money, and it is certainly not the walls we build to keep the world at a distance. Sometimes it is simply a person brave enough to keep falling and keep getting back up, a person who carries something to patch the wounds with and is not afraid to hand you the bandage. And that is the end of Emma and Michael's story, and if it touched your heart even a little, we would be so grateful if you would subscribe to our channel, press like, and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that broken things can still be mended, and cold hearts can still learn to be warm. We would love to know how this story made you feel, so please leave a comment and tell us honestly, from the deepest part of your heart, what you felt as you listened, because your words mean more to us than you could ever know. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. We wish every single one of you watching good health, a joyful life, and peace in your heart every day. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next story.